Life's too short to drive boring cars. Now, tucked under the hood of any modern day car is an internal combustion engine. The motivation, it's the heart, and it's what moves your vehicle down the road. Now, as you would expect, they're very costly. Depends on the vehicle. It might cost you $2, $5, $10, or even $50,000 to replace. As a matter of fact, an engine under this hood can cost upwards of $20,000. Now, there's some things that you can do to extend the life of these engines, and I'm going to share with you 5 tips that are going to guarantee you get the maximum service life out of your engine. Let's get into it now. So the first issue that a lot of people make that you can rectify right here and now to make sure that you extend the life of your engine is proper oil service. So the main fundamentals go like this. The first thing is actually observing this. There's a reference to your owner's manual. Why? Because often there's a strong reference to the oil, the weight, and level of your oil that's required to keep this engine running strong. Also, be sure to right there to check your oil on a regular basis, just so you never get low. And why is this so important? Well, it's because if your oil runs low, there's a chance that you don't have the oil coverage within the engine to be proper lubricating. As well, if you use the wrong viscosity, that has an impact on the bottom end, rod bearings. You don't get the proper lubrication on your cam lobes. You may even have problems with the oiling of your turbochargers. Obviously, they have very fine bearings, and if you use the wrong oil or weight, it could have a negative impact on all of those systems. We also can't forget that a lot of cars nowadays use a variable valve timing system, VVTi, for example, and a lot of other different systems depending on the manufacturers that essentially are variable valve timing, and those systems rely on the proper lubrication. If you don't have that, there's a risk that your timing goes out of whack, and there's also potential damage to your engine. Now, the other problem is 20, 30 years ago, the standard was 3,000 miles for an oil service. The development of better synthetic oils comes out. Now they're pushing 5 to 7,500 miles as a standard service interval. But unfortunately, a lot of brands, for example, BMW, a lot of manufacturers are starting to extend their service intervals to 12 or 15,000 miles. Sure, they say the synthetic can handle that. It can, but unfortunately the grit that settles in the oil sometimes remains. It's all this additional carbon and contamination that wreaks havoc. The other problem is what happens sometimes, the oil filter. If you extend your oil service too far, the oil filter actually starts to break down, and it no longer provides the appropriate amount of filtration to keep your engine healthy. And so even though the synthetic itself doesn't break down, it's all of the contaminants in the oil that can really wreak havoc on your engine. Be sure to change your oil every 5 to 7,500 miles. The second thing you really need to look after to ensure the life of your engine is the cooling system. And at a glance, this is what you're looking for. Here's your overflow reservoir. This is expansion tank. And you should always, on a cool engine, not hot because you can burn yourself, but on a cool engine, you should be checking your levels from time to time. Make sure it's got the proper coolant as per the service manual, and that goes a long ways. But a coolant flush is also very important. What a flush is essentially they drain all the coolant, then they flush it out with fresh water, and then they typically refill it with 50-50 mixture of water and glycol. That protects all of the plastic parts. And this is important because nowadays a lot of cars these days use plastic parts, plastic fittings, rubber and plastic hoses. The radiator ends, of course, here are often made of plastic. Even the radiator core is often aluminum, but all the ends around it are plastic. There's usually also a plastic thermostat and a plastic water pump associated with a lot of the modern systems. And what do you think happens with plastic with extreme heat and cool cycles? With time, it fatigues. So it's extremely important that you do the proper maintenance. Once you start noticing leaks, there's a good chance you should probably start changing a few hoses. Once you gain access, I would recommend that you start changing all the parts. A lot of cars nowadays, you'll notice BMW has notorious issues for coolant leaks. Start changing a hose. If you have one hose leaking, you might as well change a whole set, because likely it'll be one, and then it'll be another one 6 months later, and then it'll be another one, maybe another 2 months later. So you definitely want to change all your hoses when the time is hit. Water pumps, very expensive part. So typically older vehicles have mechanical water pumps. They're driven off a belt, and they're essentially a simple device. But nowadays, a lot of the vehicles have electric water pumps. It makes it simpler for bleeding the vehicle, but it also gives the computer more control on the cooling components. A simple tune of a vehicle these days can alter where the cooling picks up or how long it lets the vehicle heat up before it starts to cool, before the fan starts to run. So electric water pumps give a lot more control, but unfortunately they're very expensive because there's two parts to them. There's an electric motor driving them now, and often they're buried very, very deep in the engine compartment, which makes them very expensive to replace, not just from the parts perspective, but also for labor. Same thing goes with the thermostat, and same thing goes with the radiator as well as associated hoses. So if you keep your coolant clean, you're guaranteed to extend the life, because dirty coolant starts to cause other issues. You start getting erosion within the engine. You can have issues with aluminum breaking down, oxidization. You can also have increased conductivity, which creates other problems. Vehicles have a lot of electronics in it now, and it can potentially start sparking troubles within the computer. You can start triggering different codes, and you don't want that. So you want to keep your coolant clean. That's important, and get it done at your prescribed intervals. So the third thing that you really need to take care of, and a lot of people really do underestimate it, it is actually the charging system. Down in here, for example, here this is a Mercedes, and you see that's a quick flap. You've got your negative terminal and you've got your positive terminal. Close that up. Now, if you're driving a vehicle that spends a lot of time in the garage, maybe you use it once a week or every 2 weeks, you definitely want to keep a tender on it, because if you allow the voltage to drop too low, that sometimes starts to trigger other events. If your computerized based vehicle senses a voltage that's too low, then sometimes it starts shedding load, whether it's heated seats, HVAC controls, and a lot of other components start dumping. If it gets beyond that, then sometimes it even starts having an impact on the operation of the vehicle. So you always want to make sure that the charge is up, it's where it needs to be, and at the very end of the day, if you have a vehicle with a battery that's 4, 5, 6 years of age, I would seriously consider changing the battery, just to stay on the safe side. So the fourth tip that you really need to consider to extend the life of your engine is all about treatment. So it's the proper warm-up, it's the proper cool down, and how you drive it in between that. Let's talk about that. So first of all, when you start your car in the morning, you do not want to let it idle very long. What I would suggest is when you start your car, let it rev up. It typically idles up for 20, 30 seconds, and then it'll settle out to a low idle. Most vehicles will do that. Even if they don't do that, I would still suggest not letting your vehicle idle for more than 30 seconds. Then once you hit that low idle or 30 seconds is up, start setting off. But that's not the end of it. Once the vehicle's warmed up, sure, you can drive it hard. You can drive it as intended. But until it's fully warmed, do not accelerate hard, do not race the engine, and I wouldn't suggest revving it over 3,500 or 4,000 RPM for the sake of causing additional engine wear. Be sure to just build it up with time, and that's going to help you extend the life of your engine. Because if, in fact, you do leave the vehicle idle too long, what happens is it starts to wear on the valve guides and the valve guide seals, because what happens there is the heat within the heads stays within the heads. You don't get enough exhaust flow through the heads, and that heat just sits and billows, and that cooks away on the inside of the engine. So instead of letting your car idle for 10 minutes, I'd suggest maybe even in the wintertime, maybe only a minute or so, or in the summertime when the weather's warm, definitely let it idle down and off you go, and drive it easy from there. Then as well, on the cool down, now as I spoke earlier, many cars are turbocharged today. And if it's a turbocharged car, it's very important on the cool down. Now, a lot of older vehicles, you would actually have to let it idle down. Maybe after driving hard on a freeway, you're pulling up to the home, you basically have to let the car idle for 30 seconds to a minute so the lubrication continues on. Nowadays, it's less important because often the electric water pumps keep circulating coolant as long as it's needed. Now, unfortunately, the engine oil still is hot, so I'd still suggest cooling down the vehicle with the appropriate amount of time, i.e. 30 seconds on a hard run, maybe coming off the freeway as you're pulling up home. Definitely let it cool down for about 30 seconds. In between time, a lot of engines can tolerate high revs and hard driving. A lot of engines can't. There's performance engines, they're built much sturdier on the inside, and there's engines that are built basically pedestrian vehicles, and they're not going to tolerate hard driving. Understand the kind of engine that you have, but also understand that the wear is indirectly proportional to the life of the engine. The harder you drive it, the quicker it's going to wear. Now, the fifth tip that I have to share with you guys is one that I see so many people neglect. I've had neighbors, friends, family that actually neglect this very issue, and that is engine codes. Often you see it on the dashboard. You see this check engine light or the CEL. You see that yellow light. Sometimes it's red if it's even worse. But don't ignore those lights. I've seen lots of people ignore the lights, but that's telling you something. Whether it's an emissions-related issue, maybe a vacuum leak, possibly some other problem within the engine. If you run too long with the check engine light, sometimes the system, the computer is smart enough to know to start compensating in other areas. It might start adding more fuel then can result in more carbon in the engine. Vacuum leaks can cause a problem. Misfires can also have a major impact. That's the last thing you want to do, is run on a vehicle that's only running out of 3 out of 4 cylinders or 5 out of 6 cylinders. If it's not running smoothly, that's going to have a significant impact of the lifespan of that engine. If you see a check engine light, don't ignore it. get it dealt with right away, because that can then lead to other failures. It can start accelerating the wear on the engine. It can start adding fuel or taking fuel away when it needed most. And at the very least, if you leave it long enough, what the computer sometimes is overcompensates. It pushes the car into a limp mode, and then you can drive yourself home at 20 kilometers an hour with zero throttle response from across the city. That's not a fun experience. Trust me, I know. My BMW M5 has left me in that situation a few times. Now, unfortunately, out there's still a few really poorly designed vehicles that are poorly built, and I'm going to share with you a list right here of vehicles that won't even make it 60,000 miles because of their crappy engine. Hope to see you guys real soon. Catch you then. Bye-bye.